name is Dr. Birgit Schippers. I am Senior Lecturer in Politics at St Mary's University College Belfast. My research examines the ethics and politics of new technologies, and I have a particular interest in the human rights implications of artificial intelligence. I believe very strongly that this is a topic that isn't just of academic interest. It's a topic that should interest all of us because it affects all of us. So anyone who cares about human rights, who cares for human rights, should take a serious interest in what's happening in the field of artificial intelligence. Now, of course, developments in the field of AI have many positive uses, and I will give a few examples throughout my talk. But AI-driven technologies have the capacity to entrench already existing structures of inequality and of injustice. In fact, AI applications can be used to generate new formations of power and to create a new normal where we are subjected to decision-making and actions that are based on machine automation and tools that claim to predict our behaviour, our propensities, and our emotional states. Where we are at the receiving end of a blanket surveillance that reaches into the most private, the most intimate aspects of our lives, and where private corporations encroach on our public services such as health and education, and collaborate with state agencies in sensitive fields such as policing, immigration, border control and the military, and also where claims of accuracy and effectiveness act as smokescreens that disguise the bias, opacity and injustice generated by AI-driven systems. I want to argue that these developments call for a serious focus on how we protect and enhance our rights as individuals and communities, and ultimately how we as humans persist and create political community in a world where we live, play and work with this new technology. Before I begin with my talk, I want to give you a brief overview of the issues that I will address today. I want to begin with a brief exposition of what artificial intelligence is. I will then outline why I believe that AI is a human rights issue. And to illustrate this point, I would like to give 3 examples, beginning with a discussion of facial recognition technology, a topic that I take great interest in. I will then look at COVID trackers and pandemic drones, and I will focus my 3rd example on the role that AI plays in contemporary democracies. I want to conclude my talk today by giving a few suggestions, offering a few suggestions of what should be done to ensure that our human rights are protected and enhanced in the age of artificial intelligence. So allow me to begin with a brief exposition of what artificial intelligence, what AI is. So this is the science bit of the lecture. Artificial intelligence is really an umbrella term that refers to a whole range of what are called general purpose and what are diverse technologies. And these technologies are propelled by rapid advances in computational power. They build on methods in fields such as machine learning to advance automated and increasingly autonomous decision-making and actions. AI is often referred to as being algorithmic. What does this mean? Well, through a series of computational steps, algorithms transform input into output. So they work a little bit like a cooking recipe or like a baking recipe. You have your ingredients, you follow the recipe, and then hopefully at the end you have a beautiful meal or a beautiful cake. So algorithms do the same for AI, and they tend to work with data. So the intelligence of AI refers to its ability to determine the best course of action to achieve a particular goal. And this capacity for intelligence intersects with the capability to engage in automated or autonomous actions. Artificial intelligence has the capacity to generate and analyse huge data sets, what we call big data. It can guide a very diverse range of hardware systems, from mobile phones that we have in our pockets and handbags, one end of the spectrum, to the robotic vacuum cleaners and lawnmowers and other intelligent tools that are part of our homes, right up to surveillance cameras that are installed in public spaces and autonomous weapon systems. AI systems are also said to be able to draw inferences, to make predictions about humans and human behaviour. Now, what we need to stress is that the precise meaning of AI, the precise meaning of artificial intelligence, remains contested. And the benchmark for what qualifies as artificial intelligence is constantly shifting. This absence of a consensus stems, amongst other things, from competing visions of the future capabilities of artificial intelligence. This lack of consensus is frequently captured by the distinction between what is called narrow artificial intelligence and general artificial intelligence. It denotes capabilities that are either limited to single tasks or domains, and this is what we refer to as narrow AI, or capabilities in multiple domains, and this is what we refer to as artificial general intelligence, or what is sometimes called superintelligence. The examples that I want to give in my talk today and my wider research focuses on narrow artificial intelligence. So I'm not studying superintelligence, I'm not studying artificial general intelligence. And I believe that even within the field of narrow artificial intelligence, there are developments that should give cause for concern and that should require us to pay careful attention to what they mean. Let's explore this a little bit further. AI is a tool, and like all other tools, AI is increasingly part of human life. But it's probably fair to state that AI applications penetrate the most intimate, the most hidden corners of human life in a way that no previous tools, that no previous technology has done. So AI systems, AI applications increasingly shape our private, our professional, our social and our political interactions. And AI applications are used very widely, ranging from the technologies and tools that we have in the home. I've already mentioned the mobile phone, and any kind of smart technology that we have in the home is probably driven by AI, right up to developments and applications in the field of international finance and warfare. And of course, there's a whole spectrum in the middle, from AI applications in the workplace to sport. Many people now have a Fitbit watch, to shopping, where we're tracked and where shopping behaviour is being traced, to the education system, healthcare, manufacturing and policing. So it's really difficult to imagine an area of human life, of human activity, that has not been touched by AI. AI also provides significant benefits in a whole range of fields, from medical diagnosis and treatment to manufacturing, traffic control systems or environmental protection. AI facilitates access to healthcare or to education, the area that I work in. And to be honest, I'm not sure how I and my colleagues could have worked during the lockdown without the support, without the assistance of AI applications. AI also enables global communication and global connection, which is indispensable to democratic participation and human rights activism. In fact, AI tools and systems are increasingly used in human rights and humanitarian work. For example, AI-enhanced technologies are used to track, record and publicise human rights violations and to gather evidence or to assist communities that are dealing with ecological disasters. In the Mediterranean, humanitarian drones are used to spot and assist in the rescue of refugees as they try to reach safety. There's a growing trend amongst human rights NGOs to harness the benefits of new technologies. However, if we dig a little bit deeper, a more complex and troubling picture emerges. To stay with the example of drones, these can be used to help drowning refugees and migrants, but they are also used to police the external borders of the EU and to deter migrants from crossing into the territory of the EU. To give you another example, recent work by the TV station Al Jazeera has highlighted the use of biometric technologies in UN-controlled refugee camps in parts of Syria and Lebanon. Biometrics, such as fingerprints and facial recognition technologies, are used in the camp's food stores to replace cash or card payments. Now, there are clearly practical advantages and necessities for both refugees and camp management. But these technologies also enable extensive, localised and transnational tracking of refugees, their practices, their behaviours and movements. So AI is a human rights issue, and there is no human right that is not affected by developments in AI and by the application of human rights systems and technologies. The most commonly cited rights that are impacted on by artificial intelligence are the right to equality and non-discrimination, the right to privacy, the right to freedom of expression, assembly and association, the right to freedom of movement, the right to life, and the right not to be subjected to automated decision-making. AI does pose serious challenges and indeed threats to our fundamental rights and to the processes, the practices and institutions of rights-based democratic societies. Its propensity for automated and autonomous decision-making is replacing human deliberation and account. There are many other examples that illustrate the ambiguous quality of artificial intelligence and the threat that AI systems pose to human rights. And they all evolve around the capacity of AI systems for automated or autonomous decision-making in areas that have a significant impact on the enjoyment of our rights and that have disproportionate and negative consequences for vulnerable populations. So, to reiterate this point, while the capabilities of AI offer advantage, benefits and indeed conveniences that can enhance human well-being, those very same capabilities can be used in ways that dilute, undermine and threaten our rights. So AI's beneficent applications notwithstanding, it can be used as a technology of control, of surveillance and even of killing. And therefore policymakers and indeed wider civil society are called to task to tackle these challenges. Let me focus on 4 points. First, AI enables black box, machine-generated decisions which are difficult or impossible for humans to reconstruct. Increasingly used across a range of areas, from hiring practices to job evaluations. This shift from human to machine-generated decision-making undermines the principles of accountability and responsibility, and it is deeply problematic because it subjects citizens to decisions without recourse to human judgment. And this raises deeper concerns. Should we really delegate rights and justice to computer-generated decision-making? Second, even more worrying is the use of machine-generated decision-making in the criminal justice system, especially in policing. In an eerie imitation of Minority Report, claims to predict crime hotspots and the behaviour of individuals reflect and compound existing patterns of bias and discrimination, where access to justice is distorted through racially biased data sets that perpetuate marginalisation. Third, the impact of black box decisions on vulnerable or marginalised individuals and communities compounds the problem. For example, a recently published report by Philip Alston, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, warns of what he calls a digital welfare dystopia, where access to welfare provisions are based on machine automation and prediction, involving the surveillance and punishment of vulnerable communities. Fourth, AI systems engender public-private collaborations in sensitive fields such as public order, security and intelligence, border control, as well as research and development. These collaborations can blur the boundaries between the responsibilities of democratic states and the interests of private corporations. They can undermine transparency and the capacity for democratic accountability. There are additional concerns that the global business model of big tech corporations, such as Facebook, Amazon, or Alphabet Google, resist legal and democratic accountability, while the promotion of AI-based systems by lobbyists, often drawn from academia, can give private corporations undue influence over the direction of public. I want to move on to a topic that I have a particular interest in, and this is the topic of facial recognition technology. Facial recognition technology is a biometric technology. It records and analyses our facial images. In fact, it treats our faces as biometric data that can be used in a wide variety of contexts. So, in facial recognition technology, for example, our faces can work like a password. So many of you will have phones that can be unlocked with facial recognition technology. It is used in the home and increasingly in businesses such as shopping centres, bars, leisure centres. It's also used in policing, border control, including airports. In fact, there are attempts to introduce facial recognition technology into schools. This is already prevalent in the Chinese education system and increasingly widespread in the United States. A secondary school in Kilkenny was recently forced to scrap a scheme that intended to use facial recognition technology to monitor attendance, where it was informed that such a scheme may be in breach of European data protection regulations. Now, if our faces act like a password, there are substantial differences. While a password can be changed fairly easily, our faces, our biometric data, is highly personal and sensitive. And that's what makes this issue so pertinent. Now, facial images can be collected and analysed live in near real time, and often without our knowledge or consent, which in itself is a problem. It also works with historical images that can be held by private corporations or state agencies. And once these images have been captured and processed, they can be used to match individuals against an image database such as a passport database or driving licence pictures, police watch lists, or even against images scraped from our social media accounts. So every image of ourselves that we put up on social media can be scraped from social media and can be used to train facial recognition. The analysis of facial expression is also used for emotion recognition. And this kind of technology that claims to establish our emotional states from our facial expression is becoming very popular in China, and its deployment is particularly worrying. The American law professor Woodrow Hartsook has described facial recognition technology as a menace disguised as a gift, and I think that is a very apt depiction of what facial recognition is and what it does. Now, to date, the debate on facial recognition technology has focused on the right to privacy, and this is an important concern. But this technology impacts across the whole spectrum of civil, political, social and economic rights. For example, there are persistent concerns over its accuracy rates, which are lower when analysing darker-skinned and female faces. In recent years, the American Civil Liberties Union has tested Amazon's facial recognition technology. When used to identify US members of Congress, it found that Amazon's facial recognition technology displayed a very significant racial and gender bias. And this gender and racial bias stems from the predominantly white, Asian and male images that populate the data training sets that are used to develop facial recognition technology. Now, worries over the gender and racial bias of facial recognition are compounded if public agencies, especially those working in sensitive areas such as the police, are unduly influenced by this technology. This, of course, is contrary to the right to human review over decisions that affect our lives and not to be subjected to algorithmic decision-making systems. In fact, it would be very hasty and, in my view, ill-considered for any police force to use a technology that produces biased outcomes and whose efficacy and accuracy remains an issue of concern. These discriminatory effects of facial recognition could undermine trust in the fairness of policing, and they will leave the police vulnerable to accusations of bias and discrimination. However, fixing the accuracy problem, the gender and racial bias of facial recognition technology does not solve the issue. In fact, deployed in public spaces, facial recognition technology leads us onto a path towards automated blanket surveillance, very often without our knowledge. In my view, facial recognition technology is a blunt instrument that violates the principles of necessity and proportionality. Also, the use of live facial recognition technology by the police in spaces that are frequented by the public denies citizens the opportunity to give informed consent to the recording and analysing of their images. And this, of course, has happened quite frequently in recent years in London, where the Metropolitan Police uses facial recognition technology. I want to argue that facial recognition technology has a chilling effect on our democratic culture and on our rights as citizens in a democratic society. The kind of blanket surveillance that is facilitated by facial recognition can deter individuals from attending public events, and it can stifle participation in political protests and campaigns for social change. And we already have evidence that suggests that people from Black and ethnic minority background, as well as younger people, are reluctant to participate in public protests if their faces are recorded and analysed by facial recognition technology. Now, while facial recognition technology enables mass surveillance, blanket surveillance, it can also be used selectively. So, for example, facial recognition technology operated police body cameras as well as handheld mobile devices with the facial recognition technology app illustrate how biometric data can be used to target specific communities, very often ethnic minority communities who are already over-policed and whose relationship with the police is already fraught. And while facial recognition is often presented as a useful policing tool, I actually do not think that it is particularly helpful to the police. I have serious concerns that it will undermine relationships between the police and the communities it is meant to serve. Facial recognition technology raises the spectre of enhanced surveillance and racial profiling at the street level. There are additional concerns and fears over data security and data breaches. But a very particular issue relates to the sharing of our facial images between public agencies and private corporations. Because we simply don't know what happens to our images, where they are stored, for how long, and why or who has access to them. Evidence from the United States attests to the close relationship between the business interests of private corporations that develop and sell facial recognition technology and its use by state agencies. For example, the controversial US Immigration and Customs Enforcement. It is important to remind ourselves that the sharing of biometric data also happens on this side of the Atlantic. It's only last summer that the Metropolitan Police, the London Police, admitted that it gave images to the privately owned but publicly accessible King's Cross estate between 2016 and 2018. Luckily, opposition to the use of facial recognition technology by police forces, especially in the current context of the Black Lives Matter movement, is gathering momentum. And this trend is shaping the decisions of big tech corporations. For example, IBM has just announced its departure from the facial recognition technology business. Microsoft has halted the sale of its technology to police forces, and Amazon has introduced a one-year moratorium on the sale of facial recognition technology to the police. What we need is sufficient and independently verifiable evidence that this technology is fully compliant with national and international human rights and equality obligations and standards. Let's look at another example. The current coronavirus pandemic has generated a significant interest in the use of digital technologies that are deployed in the fight against this pandemic. Test, track and trace has become one of the mantras in the fight against COVID-19, and digital contact tracing apps are presented as a key weapon in this battle. But their use poses significant technical and political challenges. They promise to deliver a quick technological fix, but they bypass the very complex political and social dimensions of this public health emergency. Should we really put our trust into a digital tool with unproven technological efficacy and with very worrying consequences for our human rights, such as our privacy? Contact tracing apps have technical limitations, and according to critics, digital contact tracing is nothing but a pure substitute for manual contact tracing. Contact tracing apps are imprecise in detecting contact and distance, and vulnerable to abuse and fraud. Also, in order to work effectively, digital contact tracing apps require accurate infection reporting and a significant smartphone penetration. According to many estimates, at least 60% of the population must download the app if it is to work properly. But a persistent digital divide could exclude the very populations that are most at risk from the coronavirus, such as the elderly and economically disadvantaged communities. What we really need to address is the normalisation of invasive surveillance through the use of digital contact tracing, with limited impact on fighting the pandemic, but with long-term damage to our human rights. There are concerns for data privacy and human rights protection, the risk of re-anonymisation of our data, and the disclosure of personal and thus sensitive information could lead to the stigmatisation and discrimination of COVID-infected people. There are also concerns over the security of sensitive health data and the vulnerability of contact tracing apps to security breaches. Fears over the repurposing of our health data and their use by security forces or immigration agencies could actually deter people from signing up to digital contact tracing schemes. And there are legitimate suspicions that digital contact tracing apps could result in the commercialisation of health data and accelerate big tech companies' access to public health services. People's legitimate fears over the COVID-19 pandemic and their worries for the health, well-being and lives of their loved ones should not be instrumentalised to introduce an unproven technology with significant and potentially long-lasting implications for our human rights. So before we rush into a Faustian pact with digital technology and with digital surveillance, I think we need to ensure that digital contact tracing will comply with human rights and data protection standards. Contact tracing apps are just one technology that are being used in the fight against the coronavirus. Since the outbreak of the pandemic, we are also seeing a new use for drones. Now, drones are probably mostly associated with the so-called war on terror and with military activities in countries such as Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen and the Horn of Africa. But since the start of the coronavirus outbreak, drones have acquired a new role. They now deliver medical supplies to vulnerable and often isolated individuals and communities. They're also used to disinfect public spaces. In Cyprus, a man even used his drone to take his dog for a walk during lockdown. But the surveillance capabilities of this technology raise the spectre of a digital form of authoritarianism and a corresponding erosion of our rights. In many countries, police drones are being used to monitor the public's compliance with lockdown regulations and to encourage or enforce social distancing. These are central strategies in the fight against the virus. But it involves gathering personal data, such as the locations people visit. And there's an additional concern that the data collected by drones could be shared with private corporations, even with foreign governments, without our knowledge or consent. Cameras installed on pandemic drones could be used to identify people and be linked to CCTV networks that are equipped with facial recognition technology, with all the associated concerns and worries that are outlined earlier on. A police force in Westport in the US state of Connecticut has recently abandoned its plans to introduce pandemic drones that are fitted with thermal cameras. These cameras can identify symptoms that are associated with the COVID-19 infection. Of course, they do not provide a reliable diagnosis of such an infection. So the identification of symptoms include identification of increased heart and respiratory rates, a raised body temperature, coughing and sneezing. But despite assurances that such health data will remain anonymous, civil liberties campaigners in the US had serious worries that drones equipped with cameras could be used to identify individuals. So-called shout drones, drones equipped with a speaker, have also been used to spread public health images. For example, local authorities on a beach near Athens in Greece used a drone to broadcast public distancing guidance and expect to see more of this. But drones in other locations have also been used to publicly shame people who either violate social distancing rules or who are out in public without wearing a face mask. And such a use of drones is intimidating and it violates people's dignity. Now, some would argue that the use of surveillance tools such as drones is a price worth paying if it helps to control the spread of infections. But a little bit like digital contact tracing, drones offer a simplistic technological solution, a technological fix to a very complex public health crisis. And as many governments accelerate their exit from lockdown, I believe it is imperative that we assess the long-term human rights implications of drones and the likelihood of their continued use. Like facial recognition technology, the overzealous deployment of surveillance drones can damage public trust in the police, in public bodies and in lockdown measures. There's also a real worry that using a health crisis to justify the introduction of public surveillance will enable it to continue after the emergency has passed. To prevent this scenario from unfolding, I believe that we need to have a serious conversation about the use and oversight of drones, how their use impacts on our rights, and their effectiveness in combating the pandemic. Because the actions that are taken during the pandemic and the use of technologies that implement them must be lawful, necessary, proportionate and time limited. And the use of drone surveillance during the pandemic must be carefully balanced against protecting our human rights. It should undergo robust and independent ethics reviews and be subjected to human rights impact assessment. And without these assessments, drones could become just another building block of a surveillance architecture that may last well into the future. For my final example, I want to bring you back to the year 2016. In the run-up to the 2016 US presidential election and Britain's Brexit referendum, a then little-known company called Cambridge Analytica worked with the Trump election team and with the pro-Brexit campaign in Britain. Cambridge Analytica's activities focused on data analysis techniques, and these were made possible by the harvesting of data from over 50 million Facebook users without their consent or knowledge. Assisted by a specifically designed algorithm, the profiles of Facebook users were analysed to identify personality traits and potential voting intentions. And this information helped to identify swing voters and to target them, to micro-target them with messages that, according to critics of Cambridge Analytica, constituted deliberate misinformation. Now today, in 2020, and 4 years on from the Brexit referendum, Cambridge Analytica has really become the epitome, the byword for technology-driven interference into the electoral process. The data analysis techniques that are deployed reveal the growing use of artificial intelligence in our democratic processes and institutions. Now, of course, we all benefit from AI-driven communication platforms that facilitate public debate, connect people, and ease the flow of information. And all of these characteristics are core elements of democratic discourse and deliberation. Without these platforms, without the tools that are driven by AI, I wouldn't be able to speak to you today. I wouldn't be able to communicate with you today. However, there are legitimate, very legitimate concerns that AI applications can be used to undermine democratic politics. And these concerns extend beyond worries over interference into elections. They go to the heart of democratic politics and to the attending relationships amongst citizens, between citizens and their elected representatives, and between citizens and public agencies and bodies whose role it is to serve and protect the public. I want to highlight just one example that, in my view, merits increasing attention. This is the issue of deepfakes. Deepfakes are AI-generated manipulations of people's facial images, voices, or the content or mode of delivery of their speech. And deepfakes enable interference into democratic elections that extend well beyond the data analysis techniques that are associated with Cambridge Analytica. Deepfakes have gained recent notoriety when a speech delivered by Nancy Pelosi, the leader of the Democrats in the United States House of Representatives, was altered to make it sound slurred and create the inaccurate impression that Pelosi was intoxicated. Such alteration is deceitful, and it can undermine the credibility of democratically elected politicians, or indeed of those preparing to stand for public office, or to ascribe statements and positions to individuals that they in fact never uttered. I hope we all have a good sense now of what the issues are and what the problems are. But of course, the key question is, what should we do about it? What should be done? And this is a question that I often get asked when I talk about AI and human rights. Now, efforts to establish political and legal oversight over AI applications, whether at national, at supranational or at international level, have been underway for some time. However, there is a real concern that economic, military and security strategic interests may shield AI development and the deployment of AI applications from democratic and legal scrutiny. Besides, attempts to establish national regulation can appear futile in the face of the global reach of AI development and deployment, and the global reach of big tech corporations. So there is a real need for international cooperation and collaboration. As I sought to argue throughout this talk, AI is a political issue and it requires political responses. So in conclusion, I want to make 3 suggestions of what could be done and what should be done to drive the debate about AI and human rights protection forward. First of all, given the wide-ranging impact of AI on potentially all areas of human life, I believe that we need a much more prominent and wide-ranging conversation than is currently taking place. Such a conversation must reach a broad range of participants and include individuals and communities who are on the margins of the political process and of the evolving digital world. Citizens' jury projects on the use of AI in automated decision-making offer a very useful template for these kinds of conversations. They are participatory initiatives that connect civil society and individual citizens with the digital age, and they raise the knowledge and awareness of ethical and political challenges of AI. And such conversations should also bring in tech workers who have done much to publicise the working practices of big tech corporations. Second, the protection of fundamental rights requires attention to AI's impact on the whole range of civil, political, economic, social, cultural and environmental rights. Where necessary, existing human rights protections must be updated and complemented by national laws and international agreements. The sociologist Anthony Giddens has proposed what he called a new Magna Carta for data, and I believe that the Toronto Declaration and the Montreal Declaration, both from 2018, serve as useful templates for such a new Magna Carta. Third, the processes and procedures that ensure the effective functioning of our democratic institutions, including their legality and legitimacy, must be safeguarded. And this includes the effective protection of electoral processes in the digital age and the compliance of big tech corporations and other actors with electoral laws and procedures. Compliance must extend to those who design and develop AI and include the licensing of existing and new applications, an effective framework for corporate and research governance, and the disclosure of conflicts of interest on the part of researchers and members of tech ethics boards who are funded by tech companies and who participate in public discourse. the convenience offered by artificial intelligence applications, including the capacity to process and analyse huge amounts of diverse data, must not serve as an excuse to undermine human rights or to bypass the accountability and responsibility of public bodies. Thank you for taking the time to listen to my talk, and thank you also to Féile for facilitating this conversation. If you have any questions or queries, please feel free to contact me via email or Twitter.